Hello everyone, welcome to Macroeconomics. Today's topic is regarding economic measurements of GDP and real GDP and the different ways to compute real GDP, gross domestic product. Let's get started with today's session and thank you for joining. In today's lessons, we're going to analyze the economic gross domestic product of a country such as the US, and the United States has had an increase in real gross domestic product over the last 40-50 years. Gross domestic product itself is the level of output that is produced in a given country for a specific year or for a period of time. In this case, we have the United States gross domestic product from 1960 all the way to 2013, indicated by the blue curve that is upward sloping, that indicates that the level of output of the United States has consistently increased and the value of output has increased over the last 40-50 years in the economy. In the 1970s, the U.S. gross domestic product, the level of output produced in a given country for a specific year, was below $5 trillion. In 1990, that had increased over $5 trillion. By 2010, it exceeded $15 trillion. And in 2013, it was approximately $16.7 trillion in U.S. dollars. China, important conditions of China, the Chinese economy began to boom and significantly increases domestic production of goods and services to supply the international community in the mid-2000s. And it has increased rapidly and is expected to be one of the most economically advanced countries worldwide by 2030. It's already one of the biggest economies in the world, but it's expected to take a major role in the next decade. Let's get started with GDP and the analysis of GDP and how GDP can be explained further with this discussion. Okay, gross domestic product. What it is the total market value of all final goods and services produced annually within a country's border. We can analyze gross domestic product annually and compare it to a different year or a prior year in the past, and analyze the real changes of production from one year to the next or from one decade to a different decade and so on. Gross domestic product is very important because it signals the economic productivity of a country, and the greater the gross domestic product in real terms and also in nominal terms, the greater the potential economic capability within a country. Now, calculating GDP has different ways. One of them is the very simple method that we're going to use to start the session. In gross domestic product, using the simple method, gross domestic product, GDP for short, is the summation of the product's prices of all the goods and services times the quantity of the goods and services produced. So it basically is the price of the good times the quantity of output produced. In simple terms, the value of the good produced times of the goods produced added together, however many goods there are. Price times quantity gives us the value of those goods. So we have the simple equation for GDP calculation. GDP, gross domestic product, is equal to the summation of the price of the good times the quantity of the good produced. If there's many goods, then we add price times quantity of one good plus price times quantity of the second good plus price times quantity of the third good, and so on. Gross domestic product in simple calculation can be analyzed for a simple economy that produces simple goods, and in real life, in reality, the economy produces thousands of goods, but we're going to do it first in a simple method approximation. This is referred to as the nominal GDP, to say the least, because it's output in current dollars or in current prices. The nominal GDP, it's essentially the price times the quantity of the good, because you have the price of the good in current value and the quantity of the good produced for that particular year or that particular time frame, multiply them together, and you get the level of gross domestic product, which in this case is nominal GDP. Nominal GDP is the value of output measured using the current prices or the price level times the quantity of the good for that particular current year. So we have current year number one, price of good X is $10, and the quantity of good X produced is 100 units. We multiply 10 times 100 to get the value of GDP, nominal GDP. $10 times 100 is $1,000 in the value of, in this case, the units produced, which is the level of output, $1,000. Year number two, we have an increase in the price to $12 for good X. The quantity produced increased to 120. So we'll multiply 12 times 120 12 times 120, that gives us the value for year number 2, gross domestic product in year number 2. In year number 3, we have $14 for the price of good X times 140 for the units produced. There's a little bit more produced. 14 times 140, that will give us 1960. Individually, each particular year, we have gross domestic product for year number 3, gross domestic product for year number 2, and gross domestic product for year number 1. If you notice gross domestic product in nominal terms, every year it seems to increase. The level of output is increasing. The price of goods and services are also increasing slightly. So here, nominal GDP is rising. We have to be careful with nominal GDP increasing because sometimes the price level can increase more than the actual output, and it may seem like GDP is increasing, but it's actually the price of the good that is pushing the nominal value of GDP higher. So often cases we need to consider also the increase in production, the increase in real production of goods along with the price level. For that, we need to calculate the real analysis of real GDP. We need to analyze real GDP to look at the real change in production and also to account for the fact that prices can increase from one year to the next, and the level of output can actually, and it should increase in real terms. Otherwise, if prices increase and output stays the same, nominal GDP is going to rise because of the price condition, and we may not have a true increase in GDP. So we need to differentiate between nominal GDP, which measures the value of output in current dollars, and real GDP, which measures the real change in GDP over a period of time. So real GDP here is the value of the entire output produced annually within a country's border, adjusted for price changes from one year to the next. And to do this, we often use a base year as a point of reference. The base year is crucial when you do a real analysis for GDP. You look at the output of one year in comparison to the prior or the previous year, and look at the real change in the value of the output. So we need to adjust for price changes because if the price increases, it may actually inflate the actual GDP. So we have here the top 20 most advanced economies in the world. And in the top 20 most advanced economies of the world are those that have the greatest economic capability of production in real GDP terms, or the highest GDP per capita, which is the value of output per person. That includes economies like the United States, in real GDP terms like China, the European countries, along with other Western nations. But we have 20 advanced most economies in the world that have the greatest level of output in GDP terms, and also potentially some of the highest GDP per capitas in the world. Now, computing GDP using a base year as a reference. I'm going to start differentiate between real GDP and nominal GDP because those two are slightly different. We'll have to analyze real GDP calculation as the value of output for a specific year times the prices of the goods in the base year. So here we have it. We have year number 1 is our base year. This is our point of reference. For any other year, like year number 2, year number 3, we're going to use the prices of year 1 to look at the real change in real GDP. In other words, we want to make sure that the actual output increase in real terms more than the price increases here. So the slight difference between real GDP and nominal GDP, it's very basic. Nominal GDP is just the price of the good times quantity in here. That will give us the value of nominal GDP, or you can just say GDP for year 1, which is the base year. Year number 2 is 12 times 120. 12 times 120, that's 1440. And year number 3 is 14 times 140. That gives us the nominal output for year number 3. For real GDP, we look at the base year prices. The base year, which is year number 1, the prices were $10, and we have $10 for output of 100. That's 1,000. It's the same. Notice that real GDP of the base year is the same as the nominal GDP of the base year, because the base year here is year number 1. So both of them are the same. But for year number 2, we have 120 units of output that have increased in production. And we want to multiply times the value of the prices of year number 1 here, which is $10. 10 times 120 is 1,200. And the output of year number 3, which is 140 times the prices of the base year, which is year number 1. The base year prices could be any base year, could be base year 2 or base year 3. We want to look at the real change in GDP, which is analyzing the real increase in production here from 100 to 120 to 140 times the prices of the past, to look at if the actual output did increase here. In real terms, output is increasing, and the value of that output is increasing here. But if you notice, it's slightly different than nominal GDP, because nominal GDP is the current prices. Now, the general equation for real GDP calculation is the following. The real GDP calculation is using the base year prices, any base year, and we are in 2020, for example. And if we want to look at the real increase in GDP in comparison to 2010, we need to look at the consumer prices for 2010, put those prices here. This is typically the CPI, consumer prices for 2010, times the quantity of output of 2020. The reason we're doing this is to see if there's an actual real increase in production from 2010 to 2020, where the output actually increases over those 10 years or yearly in comparison to the base year prices. So this is important. You need to differentiate between real GDP calculation and nominal GDP. What does it mean to have real GDP that is higher one year than another year, or if real GDP is actually lower? Well, it really depends. If output did in fact increase, then real GDP will be higher. And it indicates that output or production or the employment of resources have increased. So real GDP in real terms, it should only increase when the output increases significantly, the productivity, the production, and so on. It's possible that for 1 year, the productivity or the output actually stays the same or it declines. So for another year like 2020, where everything shut down, the real GDP could actually be lower. So real GDP only potentially can rise in real terms only if more goods and services are produced from 1 year to the next. In real terms, the value of prices can also increase, but in real terms, one of the fundamental pillars is that real GDP can rise significantly more only if more goods and services are produced from 1 year to the next, and it falls if goods and services actually stop being produced or they stay stagnant or the same. You can also see an increase in real GDP if there's a slight increase in output and slight increase in prices. When you compare it to the previous year, you can actually analyze it there as well. But for the most part, if you want to be really conservative, really strong about GDP analysis, real GDP should only increase if more goods and services are produced from 1 year to the next in comparison to the previous year. Now, when computing GDP, we need to simply multiply the price of each good times quantity of the good produced. In the first analysis, we only had one price and the quantity of the total units produced. Sometimes we have multiple goods with different prices for that year. So you need to do each one and add them together to find the GDP for that year. The US economy in real life is too large to measure the price of every good and the quantity of every good. There could be thousands of goods, and we will have to add all of them for 1 year. And it could be measured using other methods. If we have like 5 goods, 10 goods, then we can do the price times quantity, price times quantity, price times quantity, price times quantity for those 10 goods for that year, and add them together, and we get the total value for those 10 goods with different productions for that year. But the U.S. economy is relatively large, so we can calculate GDP in broader perspectives and also in in-depth analysis. We can measure it in 2 ways. The most common way is the expenditure approach, and the income approach. So let's take a look at the different ways to analyze economic GDP or real GDP in any country, or in this case the U.S. economy, when we produce goods and services such as residential housing, cars, automobiles, or regular amenities for the economy. Gross domestic product analyzed often the analysis of gross domestic product only includes the final production of goods and services, the final item, like the brand new car. That's the final item. Not anything in between, not intermediate goods, things that are part of the production process, like the wheel, the seat belt, the engine. Those are all intermediate products that go in the production of the good. So it excludes intermediate goods. A good that is an input in the production process, it's not counted. It's counted at the end as the final production of goods. It also excludes any other stage of the production process that and specifically it excludes intermediate goods to avoid double counting. Because if you have the final product with the car fully produced, and you count the intermediate goods again, you're going to have a double counting mechanism or error or inflated GDP. You may count a one good more than once when computing GDP. If you include the intermediate good and then you also include the final good together, then you may have two engines instead of one documented. So you just want to include the final good, like the computer. A computer has a processing board, the keypad, any other electronic stuff inside, but we don't have to include every single part of it when you analyze GDP. You just include the final value of the product, and anything in between is computed as the final good. New goods, new produced final goods. It also excludes used items. So in the production of a car, we have one new car, which is the price at this amount and is the final value of the good. Anything between is an intermediate item. The glass, the tires, the engine, the doors. We count it all together, all of it at once. It excludes other factors as well. It excludes non-market goods and services that are not formally registered, non-market transactions, like in this case, for example, a stay-at-home babysitter that gets paid cash. It may not be included in the market if it's not registered, or any transaction that is not recorded. Underground and illicit activities are not part of GDP calculations or real GDP. Used items are not included because they're used. They have already been measured in a prior year GDP. So if you sell a used car to a friend, it's not part of this year's GDP. It was part of when it was first sold, but not today. Financial transactions is important because we have millions of financial transactions taking place every year, but they are not included in GDP calculations. Real GDP analyzes the production of all goods and services, all final goods and services produced within a given year for a particular country. The financial transactions that are traded, financial instruments, are not counted. Why? Because those are financial mechanisms. They facilitate the exchange and the production of goods, but only the production of goods are counted. Now, another thing that is excluded is government transfer payments. Transfer payments are some form of payment that a person receives without really doing much. These are supplemental insurance, supplemental Social Security income, for example, or some supplemental assistance programs where the government just provides some financial compensation. It transfers funds from one account to the next. It's not generating any production of goods. So transfer payments are excluded from GDP calculations. And GDP also excludes and does not consider an increase in leisure, an increase in well-being. It is part of it though. With the higher GDP, people may have greater well-being, but it doesn't account for leisure, and it doesn't account for free time or anything that you do for enjoyment and relaxation. It's not part of GDP. It's an analytical measure that analyzes the production of goods and services. Some people may work more, some people may work less. It depends. So it is not included. It's hard to quantify leisure. What's leisure for some may not be for the other person, and so on. Gross domestic product is not adjusted for external effects generated in the production process. So the economic growth often comes with certain goods and certain economic bads. We have economic goods that are good, and we have economic bads or negative externalities that may actually be harmful to the economy or to society at large. When an economy grows, it produces more goods and services, measured by GDP. When there are more goods and services produced, more people are employed. More people are employed, more income are generated. More income generates more consumption, more savings, more access to different resources, greater inclusion and the development of businesses. And that creates economic growth and economic prosperity and economic progress. But in the process, there are certain things that are built. Power plants. There are carbon emissions that are released to the atmosphere that are not necessarily accounted in GDP. Only the final production of the energy or the plant that is being used for, it's accounted. But what's released to the atmosphere may not be fully taken into account. Until recent time, government officials have begun to be concerned with the environmental effects of certain production lines that are damaging and harmful to the environment. But it's relatively modern. It's always been there, and our generation is one that has polluted the atmosphere a lot more than prior ones, but although it's an ongoing effect. So we have seen various ways that policymakers are attempting to reduce carbon emissions, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, carbon nitrate, and so on into the atmosphere because it has long-lasting damaging effects to the atmosphere. When an economy grows, when it industrializes, when it accelerates its economic productivity, it may generate economic side effects such as pollution. And those can be harmful and hard to fix if they're not taken seriously into consideration. Some people argue that it is present and important matter. Some people argue that it may not be. To some extent, it is an important matter to address. Now, another way to measure or to look at GDP and look at country economic comparisons is the GDP per capita, gross domestic product per person, per household. And GDP per capita, it analyzes the productivity per person. And it's done typically by dividing the country's GDP, the level of output, by the population in the country. That gives you the GDP per capita for that country. Although some population individuals may not be working, some population individuals may be older or young, but it does this, so that's a potential criticism to GDP per capita. The GDP per capita, it's the level of output for a country divided by the population. That gives you to some extent, the output per person in monetary value, and also in the capability of the person's ability to generate income. So in 2015, the GDP per capita in the U.S. was approximately 56,115. What that means is that the person in the United States has a potential output capability of 56,000, approximately a little bit more, just by being in the United States. In comparison to other countries, the GDP per capita may be a lot lower or a lot higher, and so on. So you can use the GDP per capita to do a direct comparison for each country in terms of the output per person and the financial capabilities of a person. GDP per capita can actually estimate the potential income earnings of a person. This can let us know that the person in the United States may have a potential average income of $56,000 in comparison to a different country that may have lower GDP per capita. But what we see is that often cases, countries with substantially higher GDP per capita may not be relatively more happy than other countries with lower GDP per capita, and vice versa. In some sense, it does. Sometimes countries with low GDP per capita may be relatively unhappy because they don't have the financial means to cover their resources, or they don't have enough infrastructure, and so on. But more money doesn't necessarily always mean more happiness, and more happiness is not always attributed to more money, only to some extent. more money or more income or greater capability or greater GDP per capita can thus contribute to greater economic and social well-being, but to some extent. GDP per capita analyzed further, let's take a look, for example, at the country of Canada. Canada in 2011 had a GDP per capita adjusted for purchasing parity or the capability of consumption in the country of $50,000. The United States, this is prior to 2015, was 48,000. So in 2011, the United States had a GDP per capita of approximately $48,000. It increased by 2015. Japan has a GDP per capita. This is the level of gross domestic product divided by the income, the the population, the gross domestic product divided by the population for a specific year. So in this case, Japan has approximately 45,000. Mexico is quite interesting because it is right next to the U.S. and right next to Canada. There are trading partners, and they're in the same Western region, but yet their GDP per capita in 2011 is only $10,000, or was only approximately $10,000. It gives to say that Mexico has a long way to go per capita. There's a lot of great places in Mexico, beautiful places, touristic places, very wealthy, rich areas in Mexico. Some of the best, wealthier areas could be in Mexico. But per capita, per citizen, on average, for citizens, they're still way behind. Mexico needs to improve. It needs to improve in their policy making, in their economic decisions, in their stability of their country, in controlling certain sectors that are unstable, and also the crime rate there is very significantly affecting society. So Mexico needs to improve a lot in comparison to the world. China, for example, is very interesting because it does have a low GDP per capita. China has a low GDP per capita as of 2011. It's grown a lot more as of 2020. It has $5,000, but it has to do because if we look at the definition, GDP per capita is the gross domestic product divided by the population. They have 1.5 billion people. Their GDP, the real GDP, and the gross domestic product for any given year is relatively one of the highest in the world. But GDP per capita is lower because they have a significant number of people. China and India have the most population countries in the world. Although China, it is one of the economic powerhouse. So we need to analyze for that. In GDP per capita, they still need to catch up. But in productivity and GDP, real GDP, they're increasing. So to touch base on the more money, more happiness is not always the case, at least to some extent. Money does facilitate a lot of things, and it does help provide different economic well-beings. And it does facilitate a lot, and it could improve someone's well-being. But let's analyze here. In Burundi, in the heart of the motherland, Africa, the GDP per capita per person on average is $275 a year. This is a year. We're looking at GDP per capita per year. So that's about between $1 to $2 a day, if anything, if it has increased, right? And that goes to say that in often cases you can have a relatively enjoyable life and yet not attributed to money. But in Western nations, money does facilitate a lot of things, and it does improve a lot of different economic conditions for the person. It's relative. It is relative in terms of what we're comparing. Analyzing GDP further, we have a way to calculate gross domestic product using two different approaches: the expenditure approach and the income approach. We're going to use the expenditure approach extensively and more often to analyze economic GDP. And what it is the expenditure approach is the sum of the spending on all final goods and services in different sectors of the economy. For the consumers, the government, the investors, and the foreign sector. So when we're looking at the four sectors, we have households, which are the consumers that consume goods and services. We have the business, the firms, and the private sector that are part of the investment category, or the private sector investment. And we have government, who is our government officials, and government does contribute a lot to the economy. and they have government purchases, and the foreign sector, which include exports and imports. So we have these are all one category: households that consume, businesses that invest, government that purchases goods and services, and the foreign sector, which is we import or we export. So the four categories are consumption, investment, government, and net exports. And we're going to allocate each specific category and analyze it independently. So using the expenditure approach is very common to compute GDP analysis. And it allows us to see in each category what consumers are consuming, what investors are investing, and how to analyze investment, government expenditure, and the foreign sector. And we get this equation. Gross domestic product, the traditional equation, is consumption plus investment plus government spending plus exports minus imports. This is gross domestic product is equivalent to C plus I plus G plus X minus M, imports. So it's consumption, investment, government spending, exports minus imports. This is a very well-known equation. Make sure to be familiar with it because a lot of things will fall under consumption, several things will fall under investment, government purchases, and exports minus imports. We are either exporting goods somewhere else to the foreign sector or importing goods from the foreign sector. We have the famous well-known equation, GDP is equal to C plus I plus G plus export minus imports. Let's take a look at what's in each one of them. In consumption, we have spending on the consumption part. We have spending on durable goods, items that last for a long time, like a car, some particular computers, for example, dining. Those are durable goods, things that last for a long time. And the consumers buy non-durable goods, things that you consume right away, like food or easily disposable items. I often like to differentiate between durable goods and non-durable goods. Think about durable goods, things that will last you 3 to 6 months to a year or more. And non-durable goods are things that you consume right away. Within today, the item is gone, or the next day, the week or so, typically less than 6 months, to be conservative. Or a non-durable service, when you go to get a haircut. You get a haircut for a day, it's a consumer good. You get the haircut in one day, and then the next 15, 20 days it grows a little bit more, and so on. Investment, it's done in, when we think of investment, this is economic investment. Make sure to differentiate between financial investments and economic investments. Investment here, we are referring to investment in newly produced goods and services, capital formation, the development of infrastructure, changes in business inventories, the purchase of new land, of land to build residential housing, things that are going to be produced, intangible items that would generate some output, some good. Economic investment is what we're analyzing here. We have public investment, private sector investment, as long as it's the formation of capital goods. Inventory investments is when we accumulate stock inventory to satisfy the consumption or to satisfy economic activity. And often referred to, I often use the analogy of, think about the automobiles dealerships. There's a lot of dealerships that are often along the freeways or the highways, and when you drive through the highways, you see like stocks of cars that are just there sitting in the parking lot. Those are inventory investments. The company or the dealership invests in getting those automobiles there so that later on some consumers will consume them. They can either stock up a lot if there's unsold, or they can either decline if the economy is moving forward. That also has to do with the production of goods and services as well. Now, fixed investment is also a part of the investment category. Here is businesses that purchase capital equipment, machinery, factories, and so on to continue the production process. Fixed investment is, in this case, is the purchase of capital goods, machinery, and equipment. You buy them once, and it's you have the equipment and it for the entire year, and then you spend an X amount of dollars as fixed. new residential housing. So sometimes are durable. The stock inventory can go up and down. The fixed investment is you build it, you keep it, and you hold on. Now, government purchases. What's within government purchases? Well, government purchases have a lot of different things. The government is one of the most heavily consuming bodies of the economy. We have the federal, the state, the local government purchases of goods and services, and they also generate gross investments and create highways that are interstate or the national highways, federal highways, interstates, and so on. They develop a lot of community highways, bridges, infrastructure, public stuff, and so on. And they also provide transfer payments to the public. But keep in mind that transfer payments are not part of GDP, only the actual purchases and the actual production of goods that they generate. Now, what's within the net exports? Net exports are exports minus imports. It's essentially the net difference of both. We can either import goods and services from abroad, the total domestic imports coming from the foreign sector. The U.S. economy does import a lot. Consumers in the U.S. import at a greater extent, so we have what is called a trade deficit. In the United States has been running a trade deficit for the last 60 years. It has to do with high income, high consumption, and the foreign sector provides those products. You're going to import a lot. So we have an importation of goods coming from abroad that is greater than our exports, which is for the total goods and services sold to other countries. Total foreign spending on U.S. goods. If the U.S. is producing goods, then someone else can be buying them. That's an export. But for the U.S., when you take the difference of those two, if you have more imports than exports, you have a trade deficit. If you have more exports than imports, you have a trade surplus. If your imports are equivalent to your exports, you have a trade balance. The United States has been running a trade deficit for the last 60 years and is not going anywhere anytime soon. So everybody that is saying that please let's balance the trade, let's have a trade surplus, is not going to happen anytime soon. Hard to break it, but it's not going to happen. For the last 60 years, it hasn't happened. In fact, has actually increased. You have to tell people to stop importing products. The consumer will have to stop importing products from abroad, and that's not going to happen, and you will have to lower your consumption if that were the case. And that is a controversial topic because a lot of people are concerned with the importation of goods from abroad because companies move somewhere else, jobs may be lost to the foreign sector, and they're not buying domestic and so on. In a globalized economy, that is a trade-off, but as long as the consumer continues to buy, it will continue to happen. And the U.S. does export a lot. In total value, the exports a lot, and it does import a lot. So we need to be careful in analyzing those sectors. And also has to do with the U.S. dollar is one of the most stable currencies in the world. And if your currency has a strong purchasing power, you're gonna buy from everywhere, and so on. If you want to lower your imports, you have to lower the purchasing power somehow. Okay, so net exports. It's the difference between exports minus imports. Export minus imports here will give you either a negative. If it's negative, we have a trade deficit. If it's positive, we have a trade surplus. And if these two are equal and it's zero, we have a balance of trade. Very few countries have a balance of trade. List one. If there's a balanced trade. Some countries have a trade surplus. China, for example, very well known. And the U.S. has a trade deficit in this case. So let's analyze GDP for the economy. Gross domestic product, we have the consumption, which are durable goods. Think of a car, for example. Non-durable goods, like a service when you go to eat to a restaurant, and any other service here that is provided. GDP is broken into investment, fixed investment, when you purchase new capital, plant, equipment, and formation, or the build of residential new housing. All of this has to be done new for the year. And inventory investment, when companies pile up inventory to satisfy economic activity. Purchases by the government that are federal, that are state, that are local, and net export, which is the foreign sector. We are either exporting goods or importing goods. This is the most common approach to analyze GDP, and notice how this one is actually different than the price times quantity analysis that we did earlier. Here we have a greater perspective of what's going on in the economy and what sectors are within GDP, and the components are very, very exclusive. Now, there are some misconceptions about GDP, and some of those common misconceptions are that investment may rise for several reasons. Firms may purchase more newly produced capita. Individuals may purchase new residential housing, and firms' inventory investment rises. This can be to the fact that there could be planned inventory investment or unplanned changes in inventory. Consumers may not buy as much, and essentially the inventory just sits there. I'm not really. This is not necessarily misconception about increases in GDP, but these are more important things to consider about GDP. Things happen in the economy, and often cases the economy grows, often cases the economy stagnates, often cases the economy collapses for various reasons. So firms can always purchase more capital if the economy is progressing, if the economy is growing. Sometimes firms can purchase less capital or no capital at all. Individuals may purchase more housing or not have enough income to purchase housing, so the residential sector may not grow, and firms' inventory may increase or decrease depending on what happens. If you plan for 2021, your inventory investment is going to be adjusted for 2021 or 2022, 2023, and so on. And if anything happens that was not planned, like the COVID-19, then a lot of consumers are not going to buy as many units that they would buy otherwise. So there's certain things that can affect the economy, in the economy. Now, there's two steps involved in computing GDP using an income approach. Actually, I'm transitioning here. So these are more important things to consider. Things to consider when it comes to GDP analysis. The things to know about GDP here. Not so much as misconceptions about GDP. When we're looking at, I have a pet puppy, Ch.7, that barks at the public. Okay, great. We have the income approach of GDP calculations. And GDP calculation can be calculated using the income approach. And the income approach is used often, but not as common. Most of the time we use the expenditure approach. You can use the income approach as well, and it will give you the same result as the expenditure approach, and it's a little bit more extensive. And there's two steps to analyze the income approach in GDP calculations. There's two steps that are involved. In this case is, first, we need to compute the national income for the country. And second, we need to adjust national income for statistical discrepancy. So we need to know first what's in the national income, which is the income of all economic resources. And second, we need to adjust for any discrepancy that may come about. So let's take a look at what's within the national income. The income GDP calculation will give the same amount as the GDP expenditure approach calculation in dollar terms. Both of them should be equivalent, actually, because the GDP of one year using the expenditure approach should be the same as the GDP of the same year using the income approach. If they're different, then we have a systematic calculation or error. The two steps involved in computing GDP with the income approach are the following. We need to compute the national income for the country and adjust for statistical discrepancy. And the national income is as follows. It's as following. National income is the total income earned by U.S. citizens and businesses, U.S.-owned resources, no matter where they are, where they reside, or where they're located. And the national income is the summation of all of the payments to resources, such as the land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship, and so on. And here we have the national income, and where it goes. Where do we get national income? The employees that work receive income, proprietors' income, corporate profits, rental income, and net interest. Interest earned on capital, plant, equipment. The national income here includes all of the compensation to the workers, all of the proprietors' income, all of the corporate profits, all of the rental income received, and any interest received. This is more of an accounting mechanism. You may want to use the national income for accounting purposes of where the income is going, like who's getting what amount of income. You will often find that corporate profits and proprietor income have the highest amount than any individual employee. But with employees at large, they could be relatively high as well. When you add the total summation for all of the employees, they get paid collectively a lot, but individually, each person may get less than an individual proprietor or an individual corporation. So the national income equation, this is not yet GDP. This is part of GDP. So GDP equals national income, which is all of this. Compensation plus proprietor's income, corporate profits, rental income, net interest, and then we have another part, which is the statistical discrepancy. We have to adjust for a statistical discrepancy. National income continue. So from the national income to GDP, here we must add certain things and subtract others from the equation. GDP, gross domestic product, is equal to the national income, which is all of this added together: compensation of employees, proprietors' income, corporate profits, rental income, and interest rates. That's all here. It will be a long calculation if we include them all. So understanding that it's within this nominal income, you have that understanding, then we can subtract income from the rest of the world plus income earned by the rest of the world. This to kind of offset one another. They're different, then we need to analyze them deeper. In a practice example, we may analyze those further. Gross domestic product is equivalent to the national income minus income earned from the rest of the world plus income earned by the rest of the world plus indirect business taxes plus capital consumption allowances plus any statistical discrepancy or any statistical adjustment that we need to adjust. Sometimes there's over-reporting, under-reporting, or there's things that are missing. That's the statistical discrepancy. That is, if the numbers don't add up, you adjust to make sure that they provide an accurate value that may be missing. So the equation for gross domestic product using the income approach is a lot longer, and it's analyzing a lot of different factors. So why would you want to say, well, income earned from someone in the rest of the world? You may have a U.S. citizen that is living in Europe, and is part of the gross national GDP, but is not part of the gross domestic product, which means within the country's domestic borders. So it's important to differentiate between someone that is within the country and someone that is outside the country. So gross domestic product here using the national income. So this is what I mean that the national income, it has a lot of different things. The national income by itself, it's the compensation to the employees, the workers, plus proprietor's income. National income, all of this blue in the national income includes all of these 5 factors. Compensation of employees plus proprietor's income plus corporate profits plus rental income plus net interest earned. That's all here, minus income earned from the rest of the world plus income earned by the rest of the world plus indirect business taxes plus capital consumption allowances and any statistical discrepancy. The income approach here, it's a little bit longer and it's a little bit more, we will need to know each subcategory to find out GDP. I can give you the same GDP question for the expenditure approach using the C plus I plus G plus NX, consumption, investors, government, and net exports as estimated measures for those, and calculate GDP. And I can ask you the same question with GDP, but give you the national income in all of the categories, the income earned by the rest of the world in a specific category, taxes, capital consumption allowances, and interest, and those two should be equivalent to one another. They should be, if we're looking at the same economy for the same year. If they're not, then we have to adjust with the statistical discrepancy adjustments. But for the most part, there may be a question like that, and they should be equivalent to one another. And then you just plug in the data. I will give you a lot of information that you can just plug in and solve it. Just by plugging into this long calculation, like subtract, add and subtract, add and subtract. In Washington, where you have the Bureau of Economic Analysis and Statistics, you have computer models that do this, and economists that are monitoring GDP from one year to the next, even quarterly, monthly, semi-annually, and yearly. The economy often goes through economic cycles. Gross domestic product can increase for 1 year, for 2 years, for 5 years. We can have an economic growth that can last a long time, and then boom, the economy may collapse. Something can trigger an economic slowdown. That's what we call cyclical economic activity, which is referred to or explained best in the business cycle. The business cycle, it's a graphical illustration of what happens in the economy through different phases. So we have what we call an expansion period. And an expansion period is when the economy grows and expands and economic growth increases. It reaches its highest level of economic performance after several years. And then from there on, it may slow down or it may collapse. If something triggers a collapse, that's considered a contraction. The contractions are known as recessions, mild recessions, severe recessions, a great recession, or a depression, depending on how long the contraction lasts. Now, the economy goes to cyclical trends. We have real GDP. This has to be analyzed in real GDP analysis, the real output of goods and services, because we want to know if in real terms output is increasing or decreasing. If output is in real terms increasing, the economy is expanding. If output is in real terms declining, then the economy is contracting or going into a crisis or recession over a period of time. The time frame here, this is typically to analyze the economy, we can analyze this for as much data that we have for as much time frame. 1920, the 1920s, Great Depressions. We have a significant economic contraction that lasted more than 2 years. That was known as the Great Depression. It reaches a drought, the lowest point of economic activity. The 1930s was the recovery time frame, and then the expansion going into the war in the 1940s. Then we had the several events that happened throughout the economy that led to small contractions, small expansions, and so on. We had the 1980s Arab oil embargo crisis, 1991 crisis. Then we have the long expansion of the development of information technology from the 90s to the 99s. And then we had the dot-com crisis that triggered a collapse. Then we have the 9/11 terrorist attacks that affected the U.S. economy and also generated collapse. Then we have the financial crisis. Then from 2001, 2002 to 2006, we have an economic expansion that lasted typically six years. And in 2007, 2008, 2009, we had the real estate financial crisis that led to a contraction. From 2009 to 2010, the U.S. economy expanded. We haven't had, this is important, the U.S. economy had not experienced an economic contraction for the last 10 years, an entire decade, an entire cycle. So what that tells is that every decade there's an expansion, and every decade there could be a contraction. It happens. If you look at the historical time frames, every decade there's an expansion, every decade there's a major economic event, every decade there's a significant recession, a significant crisis that can improve or affect the economy. So we go through these cyclical patterns. The recovery time is typically about a year to two. The expansion can last anywhere between 3 to 4 years or so, depending on how stable the economy is. The contractions can last as low as 3 months, or you can have a short contraction for like a month, quarter of the year. If it's a recession, it's 6 months to 8 months. If it's mild, if the recession lasts from 8 to 12 months, it's a severe, starting to get a critical recession. If it's 12 months to 18 months, you have a severe recession. If it's 18 months to 24 months, you have a Great Recession, which is the one in 2008. And if it lasts more than 24 months, there's contractions. The recessions could be a depressed economy. Like in this case, we're almost the entire year going into a crisis, COVID-induced crisis. The lowest point is the bottom, which is throughout the recovery phase. It hurts, it takes time, but it can recover. And the expansion, everybody's thriving during expansions. Most people forget that contractions occur. And in the peak is when everything is at its highest point. The economic expansions benefit the public's well-being. Economic contractions, it hurts the public's well-being. Hurts significantly a lot. Everyone is affected to some degree. If you notice this blue line here, that is consistent upward sloping, this is the growth trend in real GDP terms over time. If we include the contractions, the expansions, historically, every year there has been a major crisis event that we can actually cyclically map on this time horizon. We can still see that even with economic crisis, which can last a long time, and economic expansions that could last, several years, and people forget crises when we have experienced significant expansions. People don't like contractions. People don't like recessions. They oppose them heavily because they get used to the expansionary phase. Because everybody's thriving, everything's doing well, except if there's differences of opinions and certain things that happen in society. But this blue line indicates that in the case for the stable growth, the U.S. economy, with all of the crises and expansions, it has maintained stability of growth. So we want to make sure that this line has consistently increasing over a period of time. And the U.S. economy has grown about 2 to 3% per year when we include the contractions, the expansions, and so on. Other economies are stagnated, are lower, and that's concerning. If this upward sloping consistent growth trend is increasing over the long-term horizon, things will be okay. Now, the business cycle, it's very important to know because it helps us analyze the economy from a cyclical perspective. Economic growth increases real GDP, the real output of goods and services. Economic growth provides economic prosperity, economic well-being, access to resources, social inclusion, democratic institutions, a globalized economic sector, better access to health facilities, and so on. Standard of living increases during economic growth. But from time to time, we have economic cycles that swing the economy up and down and shake the economy, and things are not necessarily well during some economic contractions. The peak or the highest point may be temporary. The U.S. economy reaches peak between 2018 to 2019 of U.S. economic performance, and people thought it was going to continue. That's the common theme. People think they're going to stay at the high all the time, but it doesn't always happen. Some things can trigger a contraction. So the contractions is a decline when things decline for various events. And this contraction can last, as I mentioned, 6 months, 8 months, 12 months, 18 months, 24 months, recessions, mild recessions, critical recessions, depressed economy, depending on how it's induced. That throughout the lowest point of the economy, and then we go into the recovery phase. The recovery phase can take some time. And if it's a fast recovery, it can improve economic conditions sooner. If it's a slow recovery, people get impatient. But as long as the economy is recovering, which typically takes 3 months to 7 months to take place to start, or a full year sometimes, depending on how severe the contraction is. And the expansion refers to an overall general increase in real GDP beyond the recovery that can last. The U.S. experienced an expansion for 10 years, 2010 to 2019. Today we are in a contraction, in a recession. People don't want to admit it, but there is a slight recession. Typically, to specify that there is a recession, you have to have 2 consistent quarters of low economic activity, which is at least 6 months. And it has been 6 months. But the economy is recovering, so we need to wait for the actual reports. Okay, great. Thank you for joining the session today. If you have any other questions, please email me. But I enjoyed having the session this morning. Thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon. Have a good day. And I look forward to seeing